Good morning, beloved, and happy Father's Day to, well, my father who's here, and all the people who father and all the fathers present. Just wanting to change my mute so I can see your faces. There you go. Can you please join me either in song or in prayer? Los que confían en Jehová son como el monte de Sión, que no se mueve, sino que permanece para siempre, como Jerusalén. Tiene montes alrededor de ella, así Jehová está alrededor de su pueblo. Puedo descansar, que una mansión Cristo me dará. Si el sol llegara a oscurecer y no brilla más, yo igual confío en el Señor, que no va a fallar. Amen. That's Psalm 125 that we just read, and it's typically, as some or most of you know, my grandfather passed away this week, and so that is what is also typically sang at funerals, and it's also what I sing to my mom every time she's having a rough time, because it says to rest in the Lord. Even when the sun doesn't shine, we still trust that God is with us. So today the sermon is Onward, even when. We move onward even when. Seguimos adelante aunque. Though the fig tree doesn't blossom and no fruit is on the vines, though the produce of the olive fails and the fields yield no food, though the flock is cut off from the fold and there is no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will exalt in the God of my salvation. God is the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of deers and makes me tread upon the heights. Aunque la higuera no florezca, ni en las vides haya fruto, aunque falle el producto del olivo y los campos no produzcan alimento, aunque se acaben las ovejas del redil y no haya vacas en los establos, con todo, with everything, con todo, yo me alegraré en el Señor y me gozaré en el Dios de mi salvación. El Señor Dios es mi fortaleza, Él hará mis pies como venados y me hace andar sobre las alturas. Seeing how we understand the importance of material needs and are aware of the painful disparities in the distribution of riches, land, and goods, Habakkuk might seem to us a little bit naive if we only read this passage, because he professed a hope and a trust that had seemed to have no grounding and resembles mere a positive thinking. But at the beginning of the book, Habakkuk is actually questioning God's lack of intervention in the face of all the injustice and violence towards his people and the crying out for justice. So chapter 1 reads, O Lord, how long must I call for help before you listen, before you save us from violence? Why do you make me see such trouble? How can you stand to look on such wrongdoing? Destruction and violence are all around me, and there is fighting and quarreling everywhere. The law is weak and useless, and justice is never done. Evil people get the better of all the righteous, and so justice is perverted. any resemblance to our current situations, just a mere coincidence. Lately I have been watching Onward, the movie Onward, like at least once a week. It just makes me happy. But mostly, I have been reflecting on agency, responsibility, and justice, and how these things show up or not in the systems we create or are created for us. There are lines, sometimes as intersections of complacency and evil. There are lines, sometimes as intersections of hope and justice making, lines between anger and righteousness, lines between wariness and apathy. Sometimes, and I joke in all seriousness, about running towards a cave like Elijah, and not out of fear, but out of defeat and being fed up, staying there. Por estar harta de la injusticia, de sentir impotencia e infertilidad al mismo tiempo ante todo lo que está sucediendo. So where do we stand? Where is solid ground? What is my intersection? Where are my lines? Trusting in God affirms and emboldens us as a community and individuals to move onward even when there is indiscernible chaos. The church, and I don't necessarily mean the church as institution, but the church is an optimal place for the coexistence and intersection of patient that waits on hope and urgency of the hope to be put in motion. Many of you know that my doctoral work is focused on hope, and last year Laura Ruth did a wonderful job translating that work so it could be incarnated in our congregation. I worked with hope not because I had it, but because I am constantly losing it. That is when I am ready to go in the cave and remove myself from all systems so I can neither be oppressed or the oppressor. So I encountered the work of Rubem Alves. He's a Brazilian theologian and educator. Well, he passed away. Who many of you have heard me speak about ad nauseum, hasta la nausea. And he notes that our society is not only sick, but designed to perpetuate that sickness. It is absurd that humans have created a society where the goal is the apprehension and retention of power. And he argues that absurd conditions generate absurd responses. This, he says, is why we have dissenters in our society, people who are often considered to be dysfunctional elements because they do not act according to the rules. And the solution for the dissenters who become aware of their condition is to give more power to the already oppressive and absurd system. He says that by adding power to the absurd, one does not abolish it. On the contrary, it becomes still more hopelessly entangled in itself. A slave must learn to love their master. He will then obey willingly. Values and thoughts can be made to coincide with those who dominate, and to obey the master will be just as sane as being free. When that happens, we see the act of domination as an expression of mercy. When our capacity to imagine, to hope, to envision something outside of the present reality is led by the belief of an inevitable future, it becomes hopeless and purposeless. People adapt to their fate in order to avoid the pain that comes from realizing to the pointlessness of their dreams. We are then convinced that there is no other option, and we are incapable of a creative act of imagining. Alves says that hope is a presentiment that imagination is more real and reality is less real than it looks. Es un presentimiento de que la imaginación es más real y la realidad es menos real de lo que parece. It is the hunch that the overwhelming brutality of acts that oppress and repress is not the last word. Es una corazonada que la brutalidad sobreacogedora de los factores que oprimen y reprimen no tienen la última palabra. It is the suspicion that reality is much more complex than realism wants us to believe. That the frontiers of the possible are not determined by the limits of the actual. and that in a miraculous and unexpected way, life is preparing the created event which will open the way to freedom and resurrection. Es la sospecha de que la realidad es mucho más compleja que el realismo quiere que creamos, que las fronteras de lo posible no las determinan los límites de lo actual, y que en una forma milagrosa e inesperada la vida prepara el evento de la creación que abrirá el camino para la libertad y la resurrección. Dura cosa es dar cosas contra el aguijón. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. G-O-A-D-S. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Acts 26:14. My former pastor, Carlos Garcia, recited this verse a lot when he wanted to say that someone was being stubborn. This passage is what the voice that called out to Paul, the apostle, said to him when it asked him why he was persecuting Christians. And you have to forgive my lack of knowledge around farming and ranching, but a goad, G-O-A-D, el aguijón, was a spear-like device made to keep cattle working while yoked and plowing the land. If they were to kick back, the farmer would poke the animal. So you learn not to kick it back because, as the passage puts in some translations, it is hard to kick against it because you only end up hurting yourself. In Habakkuk, Marvin Sweeney says, and the rest of the book is just 3 chapters, so you can read an entire book. I already made this joke, but I thought it was worth repeating. He says that it addresses the problem of theodicy, the problem of who is God in the aftermath of Josiah's death. Habakkuk's dialogue with Yahweh is designed to demonstrate that Yahweh brought the Babylonians to subjugate Judah, just opens another can of worms. But that Yahweh would ultimately overthrow the Babylonians' oppression. So what does the goad passage have to do with Habakkuk? Nothing in the sense that they are not related in the literature. But if we think about the yoke as the thing that oppresses, enslaves, and dehumanizes us, and the goads are the systems that are in place to tell us that to resist means to hurt yourself, and if you hurt yourself when kicking, then the fault relies on you. So why kick the goats? If, call it the oppressor, empire, evil, will just create more effective means of torture. Because life is an end in itself. It is meant to be lived. Because we know that the creative reality is not the exhaustion of all possibilities. Because we mitigate and shield evil from spreading as it continues to feast on the marginalized. Because our measurement and glory is not made by those who we deem as powerful, but by those who we deem as vulnerable. Those are the most valuable. So what is my intersection? Sometimes it is the burning down of the goats and the yokes. Sometimes it's giving up comfort to be equitable. The more privilege and access you have, the more choices. The more choices you have, the less trapped you are. And that the passiveness of your lack of action is a choice, not an imposition. The less access, the less choices. So always remembering that what is created can be broken down, and that as long as you can imagine it, there is hope. Yahweh's response to Habakkuk. As Habakkuk keeps saying to Yahweh, but how can you stand these treacherous evil men? Your eyes are too holy to look at that evil, and you cannot stand the sight of people doing wrong. So why are you silent while they destroy people who are more righteous than they are? How can you treat people like fish or like a swarm of insects that have no ruler to direct them? The Babylonians catch people with hooks as though they were fish. They drag them off in nets and shout for joy over their catch. They even worship their nets and offer sacrifices to them because their nets provide them with the best of everything. Are they going to use their swords forever and keep on destroying nations without mercy? And this is what Yahweh, God, responds. Those who are evil will not survive, but those who are righteous will live because they are faithful to God. Wealth is deceitful. Greedy people are proud and restless. Like death itself, they are never satisfied. That is why they conquer nation after nation for themselves. The conquered people will taunt their conquerors and show their scorn for them. They will say, "You take what isn't yours, but you are doomed. How long will you go on getting rich by forcing your debtors to pay up? But before you know it, you that have conquered others will be in debt yourself and will be forced to pay interest. Enemies will come and make you tremble. They will plunder you. You have plundered the people of many nations, but now those who have survived will plunder you because of the murders you have committed and because of the violence against the people of the world and its cities. You are doomed. The Lord will make you drink your own cup of punishment, and your honor will be turned to disgrace. You have cut down the forests of Lebanon. Now you will be cut down." And after all of this response, that is when Habakkuk makes his prayer in those final verses. Aunque la higuera no florezca, though the fig tree does not blossom. What about those, as a pastor friend asked, what about those who are exhausted and hungry because the fig tree doesn't blossom and do not know how to rejoice in God? What if I am the unblossoming fig? I found rejoicing a year after I completed my PhD. Before that, it was a swamp. I'm more of a beach girl. But what shone light through the process was the certainty of my vocation and that its fulfillment is never in the hands of the institution, but in the hands of the Holy Spirit who called me and my community, the body. Community will feed us. Community will feed us. It is not a cliche concept, but one that has been commodified and watered down by the comfortable. And sometimes the affluent who can wash off their guilt and outsource good in the world through philanthropic work, though it costs them nothing and requires very little sacrifice and substantial change. In a time where the good of the community, in a time where for the good of the community, individuality and freedom is challenged, you begin not to only see more clear the very loose morals of society, but also learn who this nation's founding God is, the hooks and the nets of the Babylonians. Where white people in Michigan are fighting for their privilege, right, to get haircuts, while in Minneapolis, Black people are fighting for their right, privilege, to breathe. Those in power will gaslight, if not minimize, the cries for liberation and justice. Onward isn't only to see or reach what is in front of us. We always do need our peripheral vision. But what it means is a continuous motion, una lucha, a struggle, not stopping even when we are dándole patadas al aguijón, not stopping even when we're kicking the goats. Why is Habakkuk saying even when? Because even if he doesn't see the hand of God in the act of creation, everything is surrounded around food and animals, right? He's not seeing God in the act of creation. He trusts that the present reality is not the only option. The present reality is not the only option. As a body who claims to know and follow Jesus Christ, we have to be prophetic and call out the sins of our society and our own complicity at times. We have to be coherent in our actions and our discourse, and we also need to be hope instead of waiting for it. My dad was sharing with me this morning one of his very typical quotes: "Si la ignorancia doliera, la gente buscaría curarla." If ignorance would hurt, people would look for its remedy. Identifying the oppressive and death-dealing systems, an understanding of solidarity that embodies accompaniment, a good dose of imagination multiplied by the work of collective action yields a hope that is sustainable even when. Amen.